When a cashier and a security guard begin to suspect a pregnant woman of stealing, the case takes a threatening turn. All Layla wanted was to buy food, but now she has to defend herself against false accusations. But when the man she called for help enters the store, the situation changes in the blink of an eye. What will happen when the truth comes out? Don't miss this story. Subscribe to the channel to find out how it ends, and post in the comments where you're watching this video from. It was a particularly long and exhausting day for Layla. Being in the final trimester of her pregnancy was no easy feat. Her back ached, her feet throbbed from the constant swelling, and fatigue seemed to hang on her like a heavy weight. Yet there was still so much to do. She glanced at her phone to check the time. It was getting late, and she needed to pick up groceries before heading home. Her husband James would be home soon, and she wanted to have everything ready for dinner. Layla found herself near one of the city's more upscale supermarkets, a place she didn't frequent often but decided to visit today due to convenience. It was known for its fresh, organic products and high prices, catering mostly to wealthier patrons. She often felt out of place in such spaces, especially now with her swollen belly, tired appearance, and the discomfort that seemed to grow with each step. But tonight, she didn't have the energy to care. She needed to get in and get out as quickly as possible. As Layla pushed the heavy glass doors open and stepped inside, a cold blast of air from the store's ventilation system greeted her. She sighed with relief, grateful for the coolness against her overheated skin. However, her relief was short-lived. From the moment she entered the store, she felt eyes on her. The security guard stationed near the entrance gave her a long, lingering look. Layla caught his gaze for a moment, but he didn't look away. His stare made her uneasy, but she brushed it off as her own paranoia. After all, she was just a pregnant woman buying groceries. There was no reason for anyone to be suspicious. Yet, as she moved through the store's aisles, gathering items for her dinner, the uncomfortable feeling of being watched grew stronger. Each step she took, it seemed like someone's gaze followed her. It was as though she was an anomaly here, an outsider in a place where she didn't belong. The occasional shopper would glance at her, some with mild curiosity, others with barely concealed judgment. She noticed, too, that the employees were unusually attentive to her movements. They lingered in her aisle longer than necessary, straightening items that didn't need straightening or giving her strained smiles. Layla tried to shake off the growing sense of unease, telling herself she was imagining things. She had more important things to worry about. The baby inside her kicked gently, as if sensing her discomfort, and Layla placed a hand on her belly, whispering a soft reassurance. "Almost done," she murmured to herself. After grabbing a few more items, a carton of milk, some vegetables, and a loaf of fresh bread, Layla made her way to the front of the store, pushing her cart toward the checkout lanes. She selected one of the shorter lines and began unloading her items onto the conveyor belt, one by one. Her movements slow and deliberate, the weight of her pregnancy making every action more laborious than usual. The cashier, a young man in his mid-20s, glanced at her briefly before scanning the first item. At first, it seemed like a routine transaction. He beeped the items through the scanner, glancing occasionally at Layla but otherwise not paying much attention. However, as the transaction progressed, Layla noticed a change in his demeanor. His casual indifference gave way to something else, something more calculating. His eyes shifted down toward her swollen belly, and then back up to her face, narrowing slightly. He hesitated for a moment before continuing, his eyes flickering with suspicion. Layla shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, unsure of what was happening. She could feel the weight of his scrutiny growing, making her feel self-conscious in a way that was both unsettling and invasive. "Are you doing okay?" the cashier asked suddenly, his voice flat, though the words seemed loaded with something unspoken. Layla blinked, momentarily taken aback by the question. "Yes, I'm fine. Just tired," she replied, trying to keep her tone polite despite the irritation that crept into her voice. She was in no mood for small talk, especially not from a cashier who seemed to be eyeing her like she was hiding something. The cashier gave her a half-hearted nod, but said nothing more. As he continued to scan the last of her items, Layla felt a strange tension in the air. She glanced at the security guard who had been stationed near the entrance earlier. He was now standing closer, watching the exchange with keen interest, his gaze darting between her and the cashier. Anxiety began to bubble up inside her. What was going on? Why were they acting like this? When the cashier finished scanning, he turned to her again, this time with an even more pronounced suspicion in his eyes. "Can you wait here for a moment?" he asked abruptly, not giving her a chance to respond before stepping away from the register. Layla's heart sank. She watched as he whispered something to another employee nearby, and soon after, the store's manager, a tall, older man with a stern expression, walked toward her. "Is there a problem?" Layla asked, her voice betraying the growing knot of anxiety in her chest. The manager stopped in front of her, glancing briefly at her cart before turning his attention to her belly. He didn't answer her question immediately. Instead, he looked at her in a way that made her feel small and insignificant, as if she were already guilty of some unseen crime. "Ma'am," he began slowly, his tone icy and formal. "We've had a few incidents of theft recently. Just as a precaution, we'd like to ask you a few questions." Layla's heart raced. "What do you mean, incidents of theft? I haven't stolen anything." The manager's eyes flickered towards her stomach again, and Layla suddenly realized what was happening. They weren't just suspicious of her. They thought she was hiding something under her clothing. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Her first reaction was disbelief. Then, slowly, that disbelief gave way to anger. "Are you accusing me of stealing?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a mix of frustration and humiliation. "We're not accusing anyone of anything yet," the manager said smoothly, though his words felt anything but neutral. "We just need to be sure." Layla's hands instinctively moved to her belly, protective and defensive. "I'm pregnant. I'm not hiding anything. This is my child." The manager didn't seem convinced. He motioned toward the security guard, who had now approached the scene. "We just need to check to make sure, ma'am. If everything is fine, you can be on your way." Layla couldn't believe what she was hearing. They thought her pregnancy was a ruse, that she was pretending to be pregnant to smuggle stolen goods out of the store. The sheer absurdity of the accusation left her momentarily speechless. "I'm not showing you anything," she said finally, her voice firm despite the rising panic inside her. "This is ridiculous." The manager's expression hardened, and the security guard stepped forward, his presence looming. "Ma'am, if you don't cooperate, we'll have to take further action. We have the right to check if there's any suspicion of theft." Tears of frustration welled up in Layla's eyes. How had a simple trip to the grocery store turned into this? She could feel her pulse racing, her hands trembling as she clutched the handle of the cart. She had done nothing wrong, but here she was, being treated like a criminal because of their unfounded suspicions. "I told you," Layla said through gritted teeth. "I haven't stolen anything." But the manager and the security guard were unmoved. The tension between them thickened as the security guard took another step closer. Layla's body tensed, her mind racing as she tried to figure out what to do next. The overwhelming sense of helplessness threatened to consume her. Shoppers around her had started to notice the commotion. Some whispered to each other, glancing at her with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. It felt as though the whole world was closing in on her, and there was no escape. She needed to get out of this nightmare. But how? Layla stood frozen in place, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel her pulse throbbing in her temples as the weight of the situation bore down on her. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. The manager's cold stare, the cashier's judgmental glances, and the security guard looming ominously close all confirmed what she feared. They truly believed she was a thief. She looked around, hoping for some sign of support from the other shoppers, but their faces reflected only mild curiosity, as though watching a scene unfold that had nothing to do with them. Some whispered to one another, eyes darting between Layla and the growing confrontation, while others simply looked away, uninterested in involving themselves. The manager, whose name tag read Gary, stepped forward, his arms crossed over his chest. "Ma'am," he began, his tone laced with condescension. "This will be much easier for everyone if you just cooperate." Layla's breath hitched. She glanced nervously at the exit, only a few yards away. But the security guard had strategically placed himself between her and the door. There was no easy escape. Layla could feel the sweat forming at the nape of her neck, and her hands tightened instinctively around the handle of her shopping cart. "I told you, I haven't stolen anything," she repeated, her voice strained. "I'm just here to buy groceries. I'm pregnant. What you're accusing me of is completely wrong." The manager sighed, as though dealing with a difficult child. "Ma'am, this isn't personal. We just have to make sure." His words felt like a slap in the face. Not personal. How could it not be personal? They weren't just accusing her of shoplifting. They were attacking her dignity, her very identity. Layla could feel a storm of emotions rising inside her. Anger, humiliation, frustration. It took everything in her not to lash out. "I won't let you humiliate me like this," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm not a thief." Gary motioned to the security guard, whose name tag read John. He was a broad-shouldered man with a stern face and eyes that seemed to gleam with authority. John stepped forward, his imposing figure casting a shadow over Layla as if to physically underscore the pressure being placed upon her. "Look, lady," John said, his voice rough and direct. "We've had a string of incidents with people using fake pregnancies to hide stolen goods. This is just standard procedure. If you're innocent, you've got nothing to worry about." Layla's pulse quickened. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. They actually thought her pregnancy was fake, that she had somehow orchestrated this elaborate ruse to steal from the store. It was beyond insulting. John continued, his tone growing more impatient with each passing second. "We can do this the easy way, or we can call the police. But one way or another, we need to check what's going on." Layla's head was spinning. The situation was escalating far faster than she could handle. Her immediate instinct was to stand her ground, to refuse to let them strip her of her dignity in front of a store full of strangers. But at the same time, the growing pressure was making it harder to think clearly. She had come here for something as mundane as groceries, and now she was being cornered and threatened, as though she were some kind of criminal mastermind. She could feel the stares from the other customers growing more intense. What must they be thinking? That she was guilty? That she really was hiding something? It was as though she were already on trial, and these strangers were the jury. "Why don't you just let me leave?" Layla asked, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "I didn't do anything wrong, and I don't deserve to be treated this way." "You can leave," Gary responded coldly, "but not until we've cleared up this situation. We're just asking you to cooperate. Let us check, and if there's nothing to hide, you'll be free to go." His words were like a trap, dangling before her. Layla knew that even if she did cooperate, the humiliation would remain. It would be a violation of her privacy, her humanity, all based on nothing more than suspicion. Fueled by racial and sexist biases, and if she refused, the police would be called, and things could get even worse. She felt caught in a vice, unable to move in any direction without causing herself more harm. The panic in her chest was growing, the world around her seeming to close in. She could feel her stomach tightening, not from anything physical, but from the overwhelming stress of the moment. Her baby kicked lightly, as if sensing her distress, and Layla instinctively placed her hand over her belly, trying to soothe the child inside. "Please," Layla began, her voice quieter now. "I'm telling the truth. I'm just trying to buy groceries." Gary glanced at John, and they both exchanged a look that made Layla's stomach churn. They had already made up their minds. "We've heard it all before," John said dismissively. "People come in here with all kinds of stories. We've got a job to do." Layla opened her mouth to protest again, but before she could say anything, John took a step closer, his hand resting on the walkie-talkie clipped to his belt. The implication was clear. He was more than ready to escalate the situation if she didn't comply. A wave of nausea hit Layla, the stress overwhelming her. She could feel her legs trembling under her, and her head began to spin. She had never felt so trapped, so utterly powerless. For a brief moment, she considered fleeing, making a break for the door and escaping this nightmare. But where would that lead? They'd chase her down, and that would only make things worse. The thought of being tackled or handcuffed was unbearable. And worse yet, what would happen if the police arrived? Would they believe her? Or would they see her as just another suspect, another black woman they could treat however they wanted? She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat nearly choking her. "I'm not going to let you do this to me," Layla said, her voice trembling but resolute. "You can't force me to strip in front of everyone. I won't let you." Gary's expression darkened. "You don't have a choice, ma'am. Either you cooperate, or we'll have to involve the authorities." John shifted his weight, looking like he was ready to act. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Layla could feel her body teetering on the edge of panic. She knew she had to think quickly, but every possible solution seemed to lead to more humiliation or danger. Her heart raced as the seconds ticked by. The store's fluorescent lights felt harsh against her skin, and the murmurs of the crowd behind her grew louder, feeding her anxiety. "I have rights," Layla blurted out, her voice rising. "You can't just accuse me of something because of the way I look. I'm pregnant, for God's sake." But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. John raised an eyebrow, unimpressed, while Gary crossed his arms tighter, his patience clearly wearing thin. "We don't care what you look like, ma'am," Gary said, though the false politeness in his tone betrayed his lie. "We just need to check. Either you let us do our job, or the police will do it for us." Layla's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the tears stinging at the corners of her eyes, but she forced them back. She wouldn't cry in front of these people. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. But the weight of the moment was crashing down on her, suffocating her. And she knew that if she didn't make a decision soon, things could spiral out of control. The crowd was growing larger now. More shoppers had gathered nearby, drawn by the commotion. Some had their phones out, subtly filming the interaction. Layla's humiliation deepened. The last thing she wanted was to become some viral video, a spectacle for people to gossip about online. Yet here she was, on the verge of being dragged into something she had no control over. Her pulse raced. What could she do? Should she comply just to get it over with? But the very thought of stripping in front of these strangers, of allowing them to paw through her personal life, as though she were nothing more than a criminal, made her stomach churn. Just then, a voice crackled through John's walkie-talkie, breaking the tense silence. It was a call for backup. Layla's chest tightened even further. They weren't going to let this go. She could feel the walls closing in on her, and her options slipping away. "Call the police if you want," she said, her voice stronger now, though her heart pounded in her chest. "But I'm not going to let you treat me like this. I've done nothing wrong, and I won't be bullied into submission." John's jaw clenched, his hand twitching towards his radio. Layla could see the irritation in his face, the way he was itching to take control of the situation. It was at that moment that Layla made a decision. She didn't want to call James. She had never wanted to involve him in something like this, especially not at work. But she could feel the situation slipping out of her control, and if she didn't act soon, things were going to get much worse. Her hand shook as she pulled her phone from her pocket. The screen felt cold and unfamiliar in her trembling fingers. She scrolled through her contacts, her vision blurring with tears she refused to shed. Then she found the name, James. With a deep breath, Layla hit the call button. Layla's hands trembled as she clutched the phone, listening to the dial tone. Each second felt like an eternity, her mind racing as she waited for James to pick up. The oppressive weight of the situation bore down on her, making it hard to breathe. The air in the store felt heavy, suffocating, as if everyone around her were watching her every move, waiting for her to crack. She didn't want to involve James. She didn't want to be the woman who called her husband every time something went wrong, especially not when he was at work. But this wasn't just about her anymore. The baby inside her kicked again, a gentle reminder of the life she carried, and that gave her the strength she needed to continue. But before James could answer, the phone call was interrupted by the blare of a police siren outside the store. Layla's heart sank. They had already called the police. Her worst fears were coming true, and she wasn't sure what was going to happen next. John, the security guard, glanced toward the front entrance, his expression hardening as the flashing blue lights illuminated the glass doors. The tension in the air thickened, and Layla's stomach churned. She had hoped she would have more time to explain, time to think, time to breathe. But now it was too late. "Looks like we don't need to wait," John muttered, casting a smug glance in Layla's direction. The arrogance in his voice made her skin crawl. The manager, Gary, stood by silently, his arms still crossed, as if he were confident that everything was about to be resolved in his favor. Layla could see it in his eyes, the way he believed that justice would come in the form of a police officer siding with him. He wasn't worried about being wrong. He wasn't worried about what would happen to Layla. He was only concerned with proving his assumptions right. The door chimed as it swung open, and in walked a police officer. He was tall and broad, his posture rigid and authoritative. Layla's heart sank even further when she saw the look on his face, cold, distant, and entirely uninterested in her side of the story. His name tag read Officer Henson, and he exuded an air of casual superiority, as though this was just another routine day at work for him. Officer Henson scanned the scene, his eyes immediately locking onto Layla. His expression didn't change, but there was something in his gaze that made her feel even smaller, more vulnerable. It was a look she had seen before, one that said, "I've already made up my mind." "So what's the issue here?" Officer Henson asked, his voice low and disinterested. He addressed Gary and John, completely ignoring Layla's presence, as if she were nothing more than an object in the room, rather than the person at the center of this unfolding disaster. Gary cleared his throat and stepped forward, speaking with an air of authority. "We have reason to believe this woman is attempting to shoplift," he explained, his tone calm and measured. "She's been acting suspiciously, and we suspect she's hiding stolen merchandise under her clothing." Layla's mouth went dry as the words left Gary's lips. The accusation felt even more real, more damning, now that it had been spoken aloud in front of law enforcement. She wanted to shout, to protest, to tell them how wrong they were, but her voice seemed trapped in her throat. Officer Henson nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Layla. "Is that right?" he asked, his tone flat, as though he had already heard enough. Layla's body tensed. This was the moment she had feared. She had hoped, maybe even prayed, that the officer would come in and see the situation for what it was, a horrible misunderstanding. But the way he was looking at her told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't here to help. He was here to confirm their suspicions, to play his part in this humiliating spectacle. John, ever the enforcer, stepped in to reinforce the claim. "She refused to cooperate when we asked her to show us what's under her shirt," he added, his voice dripping with disdain. "She's been resisting this whole time." Layla's blood boiled. "I'm not resisting," she finally managed to say, her voice sharp and filled with frustration. "I told you, I'm pregnant. I haven't stolen anything. This is insane." But Officer Henson didn't seem fazed by her protest. He merely looked at her with that same detached expression, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though he were weighing her words and finding them lacking. Gary, taking advantage of the moment, continued. "We've had issues with theft in the store recently," he said. "People have been using disguises to conceal stolen goods, and, frankly, her behavior has been suspicious since she walked in." "Suspicious?" Layla repeated incredulously. "I'm just buying groceries. How is that suspicious?" But once again, it was as if no one was listening to her. The men around her were intent on discussing her fate without giving her a voice in the matter. She could feel the walls closing in, the tension mounting with every second that passed. Officer Henson stepped closer to her now, his gaze hardening as he assessed her. "Ma'am," he said, his tone low and threatening, "we're going to need you to comply. If you have nothing to hide, there's no reason not to cooperate." The words echoed in her mind. No reason not to cooperate. As if what they were asking of her was reasonable. As if it wasn't an outright violation of her dignity and her humanity. They weren't just asking her to cooperate. They were demanding that she strip away every ounce of her self-respect to prove that she wasn't the criminal they had already decided she was. "I'm not showing you anything," Layla said firmly, though her voice shook with the weight of the moment. "I've done nothing wrong, and you have no right to treat me like this." Officer Henson's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, this is your last warning. Either you comply, or we're going to have to take you into custody." Custody. The word sent a shockwave of fear through Layla's body. The idea of being handcuffed, thrown into the back of a police car, and treated like a common criminal for something she didn't even do, was too much to bear. She could feel her heart racing, the pulse in her throat pounding as panic threatened to overtake her. But she couldn't give in. She couldn't let them strip her of everything she had worked for, everything she was. "Not like this." "I'm not going anywhere," Layla said, her voice growing more defiant. "I'm pregnant. You can't just drag me out of here and arrest me for nothing." But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Officer Henson reached for his handcuffs, his expression cold and unyielding. "That's it," he said. "You've made your choice." The sight of the handcuffs sent a jolt of terror through Layla's body. She could barely think, barely breathe. Her mind was racing with fear and confusion. What was she supposed to do now? How had things escalated this far? It was in that moment, when she felt like the world was about to collapse around her, that the doors of the store opened again. A familiar voice called out across the tension-filled air, a voice that instantly cut through the panic and chaos. "Layla." James, her husband's voice, was like a lifeline, pulling her back from the edge of despair. All eyes turned toward the entrance as James strode into the store, his presence commanding and undeniable. Dressed in his police uniform, the badge on his chest gleaming under the fluorescent lights, James looked every bit the authority figure that Officer Henson and the others had pretended to be. But unlike them, his authority came with integrity, with a deep sense of justice that had always defined him. Layla's heart swelled with relief as she saw him. She had never wanted to drag him into this mess. But now, more than ever, she was glad he was here. James's eyes scanned the scene quickly, taking in the sight of the handcuffs in Officer Henson's hand, the tense expressions on Gary and John's faces, and the panic on Layla's. "What the hell is going on here?" James demanded, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Layla and the men who had been so eager to take her down. Officer Henson stiffened, clearly not expecting another police officer to intervene. "We have a situation here," he said, his voice clipped. "This woman is refusing to cooperate in a shoplifting investigation." James's eyes narrowed as he glanced between the men and Layla. "A shoplifting investigation?" he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "And you think handcuffing a pregnant woman is the way to handle it?" Gary stepped forward, clearly trying to salvage control of the situation. "Sir, we had reason to believe she was hiding stolen goods under her clothing. She refused to comply with our requests for a search, and we felt we had no other choice." James turned his full attention to Gary now, his expression unreadable but deadly calm. "No other choice? You didn't have any other choice but to accuse my wife of stealing and threaten her with arrest, without any proof?" Layla could feel the tension shift. The men who had been so confident moments ago were now faltering, unsure of how to respond. Officer Henson cleared his throat, still holding the handcuffs, but no longer as eager to use them. "We were just following procedure," he said defensively. "She wouldn't cooperate." James took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, icy tone. "You don't get to treat people like this, especially not without reason. I suggest you rethink your procedure before you make things a lot worse for yourselves." The air was thick with tension, but Layla could finally breathe again. James was here. He was standing up for her, and he wasn't going to let them take her down without a fight. Layla stood frozen, her hand gripping James's arm as tightly as she could, trying to ground herself in the chaos. The relief that washed over her at his arrival was quickly overshadowed by the intensity of the confrontation brewing in front of her. She could feel the weight of everyone's stares, could hear the faint murmurs from the crowd that had gathered to witness the drama unfold. James was calm, but Layla knew him well enough to sense the simmering anger beneath his composed exterior. His eyes darted between Officer Henson, the smug manager Gary, and the towering security guard John. The handcuffs that Officer Henson still held seemed to gleam menacingly, a reminder of just how far this had gone. "Look," Officer Henson began, his tone still sharp but now edged with uncertainty. "We had probable cause. Your wife refused to cooperate, and the store has the right to detain anyone they suspect of shoplifting." "Suspect," James repeated, his voice laced with barely concealed fury. "On what grounds? What exactly makes you think a pregnant woman, my wife, was shoplifting? I'd love to hear the reasoning behind this brilliant deduction." Gary, the manager, cleared his throat, stepping forward as if eager to take control of the narrative. "Sir, we've had several incidents recently where people have used fake pregnancies as a cover for theft. She was acting suspiciously, and when we asked her to comply with a search, she refused. We were well within our rights to involve the authorities." Layla's stomach churned. The absurdity of what they were accusing her of felt like a cruel joke, but the stakes were all too real. It wasn't just about this moment. It was about how often she had to face this kind of treatment, being judged, suspected, and mistreated simply because of her appearance. She could feel the injustice of it all burning beneath her skin, and despite James's presence, the fear hadn't fully dissipated. They weren't backing down. James clenched his jaw, the muscles in his face tightening as he processed Gary's words. Layla could sense the internal battle within him, his natural instinct to protect her clashing with his desire to maintain composure in a situation that demanded diplomacy. But James wasn't just any man. He was a police captain, someone who knew how to handle authority and control a situation. He wouldn't allow these people to intimidate him or his wife. "Acting suspiciously," James said slowly, his voice low and measured. "And what exactly does that mean?" What was she doing that made you so certain she was guilty? Gary hesitated, his confidence wavering under James's unrelenting gaze. He glanced at John for support, but the security guard seemed just as unsure now, no longer so eager to press forward with his accusations. She seemed to be avoiding eye contact, and Gary stumbled over his words, clearly trying to come up with something that would justify the situation. And she had her hand on her stomach the whole time. We thought she might be hiding something under her shirt. Layla's jaw dropped. "I'm pregnant," she shouted, her frustration boiling over. "Of course, I had my hand on my stomach. I'm carrying a child, not stolen goods." The crowd around them murmured, some shifting uncomfortably as they realized just how ridiculous the accusation sounded. Layla could feel the humiliation rising in her chest again, her hands trembling as she struggled to contain her anger. She wanted to scream at them, to demand that they acknowledge how wrong they were, but she knew it wouldn't matter. They had already made up their minds the moment she walked into the store. James took a step forward, his body language exuding authority. He was no longer just a husband defending his wife. He was a police captain, asserting his power in a situation that had spiraled out of control. "So let me get this straight," James said, his tone dangerously calm. "You accused my wife, who is visibly pregnant, of stealing because she had her hand on her stomach. That's your suspicious behavior. And you thought the appropriate response was to threaten her with handcuffs and drag her out of the store like a criminal?" Officer Henson shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the situation had taken a turn he wasn't prepared for. He glanced at the crowd, clearly aware that more and more people were watching closely, some even filming the interaction with their phones. The last thing he needed was for this to blow up into a public relations nightmare. "We were just following store protocol," Officer Henson mumbled, though the conviction in his voice was fading. "We had no way of knowing whether she was pregnant or not." James's eyes flashed with fury. "Did you even bother to ask? Did any of you stop for 1 second to consider that you might be wrong? Or were you so eager to believe that my wife was guilty because she didn't fit into your picture of an ideal customer?" Gary opened his mouth to respond, but James wasn't finished. "And now, instead of admitting that you made a mistake, you're doubling down, trying to justify your actions as protocol. Protocol is for situations where there's evidence of wrongdoing, not for when you feel uncomfortable because someone doesn't look the way you expect them to. You don't get to make baseless accusations and then hide behind store policy when you're called out on it." Layla's heart swelled with pride at James's words. He wasn't just standing up for her. He was standing up for everyone who had ever been treated like this, like they didn't belong, like they were guilty before proven innocent. She could feel the shift in the room, the murmurs growing louder as the crowd began to side with them. People were nodding, some whispering to one another in agreement. The tide was turning. Officer Henson's hand, which had been resting on the handcuffs, dropped to his side. His shoulders sagged slightly, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he looked uncertain. "Look, Captain," Officer Henson started, addressing James by his rank now, clearly trying to defuse the situation. "I understand this is your wife, and I get that you're upset, but we're just doing our jobs here. We didn't mean for things to escalate like this." "Didn't mean for things to escalate," James repeated, incredulous. "You threatened to arrest her. You treated her like a criminal based on nothing more than your own biases and assumptions. And you think that just doing your job excuses that?" Officer Henson took a step back, glancing nervously at the growing crowd. Gary, too, seemed to shrink under the weight of the public scrutiny, his earlier confidence now a distant memory. Layla could see the realization dawning on them both. They had crossed a line, and now they were scrambling to find a way out without further damaging their reputations. Gary finally spoke, his voice quieter now, almost apologetic. "We didn't mean any harm. We just wanted to make sure the store's property was safe." James didn't let up. "The store's property? And what about my wife's dignity, her safety, her rights?" There was a long pause. The tension hung thick in the air, and Layla could feel the weight of every eye in the room on them. Her breathing was shallow, her heart still pounding in her chest. But she knew that the tide had shifted. They weren't winning because James was a police captain. They were winning because the truth was on their side, and everyone in that store knew it. Gary looked down, his face flushed with embarrassment. We didn't mean to accuse her unfairly." "But you did," James shot back, his voice unwavering. "And you're going to fix this." John, the security guard, who had been mostly silent throughout the confrontation, stepped forward now, clearly trying to salvage some sense of authority. "What do you want us to do?" he asked, his tone more conciliatory than before. James squared his shoulders. "First, you're going to apologize to my wife, publicly. And then you're going to make sure that this never happens again. Not just to her, but to anyone. You're going to rethink your so-called protocols. And you're going to start treating people like human beings, not potential criminals." Layla watched as Gary and John exchanged uneasy glances. The crowd was watching them closely now, waiting for their response. The power dynamics had shifted, and they knew it. Finally, Gary cleared his throat and turned to face Layla, his voice shaking slightly as he spoke. We're sorry, ma'am. We didn't mean to cause you any distress. It was a misunderstanding." It wasn't much of an apology, but it was something. Layla nodded, her face still flushed with the adrenaline of the confrontation. She wasn't going to push for more. She just wanted this nightmare to be over. James, however, wasn't finished. "And what about you?" he asked, turning to Officer Henson. The officer stiffened slightly, clearly uncomfortable with being put on the spot in front of so many people. "We're sorry for how this played out," Officer Henson said finally, his voice lacking any real remorse, but clearly eager to end the confrontation. "We'll make sure it doesn't happen again." James didn't look entirely satisfied, but he nodded curtly. "See that it doesn't." The tension in the room began to dissipate, though the stares from the crowd remained. Layla felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, the emotional toll of the confrontation finally catching up to her. Her body ached, and she wanted nothing more than to go home and put this horrible experience behind her. But as she glanced around at the people in the store, the ones who had watched in silence, who had done nothing to intervene, she felt a mixture of emotions. She was proud of how she had stood her ground, but she was also painfully aware of how easily things could have gone the other way. She had James to protect her, but what about those who didn't? As James placed a protective arm around her shoulders and began guiding her toward the exit, Layla couldn't help but wonder how many more times she would have to fight this same battle. How many more times people would look at her and see a suspect, a threat rather than a person. The doors of the store closed behind them with a soft chime, and for the first time in what felt like hours, Layla could finally breathe. As soon as the heavy glass doors of the store closed behind them, Layla let out a long, shaky breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The cool night air brushed against her skin, but it did little to soothe the turbulence inside her. She walked slowly, her body feeling heavier than it had all day, the adrenaline still pumping through her veins. James kept a protective arm around her, but Layla was only half aware of his presence. Her mind was miles away. The confrontation inside the store had ended, but the emotional weight of what had just happened lingered like a dark cloud. She was safe now, physically at least, but the sting of humiliation and fear still gripped her tightly, refusing to let go. Her heart continued to pound, her pulse echoing in her ears as she replayed the events over and over again, searching for what she could have done differently, for a way that she could have avoided the situation entirely. How had it come to this? A simple trip to the grocery store had turned into a public spectacle, and for what? Because she was a black woman who had dared to shop in an upscale supermarket while visibly pregnant? The absurdity of the accusation still gnawed at her. But what hurt the most wasn't just the baselessness of the claims. It was the fact that it had happened at all, that people had been so quick to assume the worst of her, to believe she was guilty before she had a chance to defend herself. As they reached the car, Layla stopped, leaning heavily against the passenger door. She was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. Mentally, her entire body felt like it was made of lead, weighed down by the shame and frustration that refused to dissipate. James turned to her, his eyes filled with concern. "Layla, are you okay?" His voice was gentle, but it was laced with the same anger that had fueled him inside the store. He had been strong for her, unwavering in his defense. But now that they were alone, she could see the toll it had taken on him as well. Layla nodded, but it was a lie. She wasn't okay. She didn't feel okay. Everything about this night had been wrong, and no matter how hard she tried to shake it off, the emotions just wouldn't leave her alone. "I'm just tired," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I just want to go home." James nodded, understanding. He didn't press her further. He opened the car door for her and helped her inside. And as she sat down, Layla finally allowed herself to close her eyes for a moment. The silence inside the car was a welcome contrast to the chaos of the store. But even as she tried to calm her racing thoughts, they refused to quiet down. James climbed into the driver's seat and started the car, but he didn't drive off immediately. Instead, he turned to her again, his brow furrowed with concern. "You don't have to talk about it right now if you don't want to," he said softly. "But if you need to, I'm here." Layla appreciated his words, but she didn't know where to begin. There was so much swirling inside her, so many emotions that she couldn't even begin to untangle them. The anger, the humiliation, the fear, it all twisted together, making it hard to think clearly. She opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. Instead, a tear rolled down her cheek, and Layla quickly wiped it away, frustrated with herself for crying. She didn't want to cry. She didn't want to feel weak, like she couldn't handle what had just happened. But the truth was, she couldn't handle it, not alone. The fear that had gripped her inside the store hadn't completely left her. And now that the confrontation was over, she felt exposed in a different way, vulnerable. As if the armor she had built up over years of dealing with casual racism and microaggressions had finally cracked. And now she didn't know how to rebuild it. "I hate that this happened," Layla finally whispered, her voice breaking. "I hate that this keeps happening." James reached over and took her hand, his touch grounding her, even as the storm of emotions continued to rage inside her. "I know," he said quietly. "It's not right. None of it is right." Layla squeezed his hand, feeling a fresh wave of frustration bubbling up. "I just don't understand why it always has to be this way. Why do they always assume the worst of us? Why do I have to be treated like a criminal just for walking into a store?" Her voice grew louder, her anger bubbling to the surface. "I was just trying to buy groceries, James, and they treated me like I was some kind of thief, like I wasn't even human. They didn't care that I'm pregnant, or that I was scared, or that I didn't do anything wrong. All they saw was my skin, and that was enough to make me guilty in their eyes." James listened, his expression softening as he watched her struggle to contain her emotions. "You have every right to be angry," he said, his voice steady, "and you have every right to be hurt. What they did to you was wrong. No one should have to go through that. Especially not you. Layla nodded, but the tears were coming faster now, and she couldn't stop them. I didn't want to call you, she admitted, her voice trembling. I didn't want to involve you. I didn't want to seem weak. I thought I could handle it on my own, but I couldn't. James frowned, shaking his head. Layla, you're not weak. You're anything but weak. What you went through tonight would break most people, but you stood your ground. You did everything you could, and when it became too much, you called for help. That's not weakness. That's strength. His words should have been comforting, but instead, they only made Layla feel more conflicted. She had always prided herself on being strong, on not needing anyone else to fight her battles for her. But tonight had proven that no matter how strong she thought she was, there were some battles she couldn't fight alone, and that realization was terrifying. I feel so powerless, Layla whispered. Like no matter what I do, no matter how hard I try to be strong, they'll always find a way to tear me down. How am I supposed to keep going when it feels like I'm constantly fighting just to exist? James's grip on her hand tightened. You keep going because you have to, he said softly. Because the world needs people like you, Layla. People who stand up, even when it's hard. People who don't give up, even when the odds are stacked against them. What happened tonight wasn't fair, but it doesn't define you. You define you, Layla's heart clenched. She knew James was right, but it didn't make the pain any less real. It didn't make the fear any less consuming. I'm just so tired of it all, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm tired of having to prove myself. Tired of fighting, tired of being treated like I don't belong. I don't want to live like this anymore. James didn't respond right away. He simply sat with her, his presence a steady comfort in the midst of her turmoil. Layla could feel the weight of his words even before he spoke them, and when he finally did, they hit her with a force she hadn't expected. I know you're tired, he said quietly, but we don't get to choose this fight. It chose us. And as long as there are people out there who see us as less than human, we have to keep fighting for ourselves, for our family, for our future. But you don't have to do it alone, Layla. You've never been alone in this. Layla wiped away her tears, her heart aching with the weight of everything they had been through. She didn't want to be tired anymore. She didn't want to feel afraid every time she stepped out of her house, wondering if today would be the day someone would decide she didn't belong. But as much as she wanted to retreat, to escape from the reality of their world, she knew James was right. This was their fight. It had always been their fight. And no matter how hard it got, no matter how many times the world tried to knock them down, they had to keep getting back up for their child, for each other, for every person who had ever felt the sting of prejudice and injustice. I know, Layla said, finally, her voice steadying, and I'll keep fighting. But it's hard, James. It's so damn hard. James leaned over and kissed her forehead gently. I know it is, he whispered, but you're not in this alone. You never will be. Layla closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her. For the first time since the confrontation had begun, she felt a sense of peace, however fleeting. It wasn't over. It wasn't over. It would never be over. But for now, they were together, and that was enough. As they sat in the quiet of the car, Layla knew that the battle was far from over. There would be more nights like this, more moments where she felt powerless and afraid. But with James by her side, she would face them. Together, they would keep fighting, because they had to. The next morning, the storm clouds from the previous night seemed to have settled, but the weight of what had happened still hung heavily over Layla. The emotions that had surged through her after the confrontation were now tempered by a sense of resolve. She wasn't just angry anymore. She was determined. The world had shown her its ugliness again, but Layla had learned long ago that the only way to survive was to face that ugliness head on. She was not about to let those people in the store get away with what they had done. As she sat at the kitchen table, sipping her tea, her mind replayed the events over and over. The humiliation, the fear, the disbelief. It all came rushing back with every sip. James sat across from her, reading the morning paper, though she knew he was just as distracted. He kept glancing at her, waiting for her to speak, to say something about what she wanted to do next. Layla set her cup down and met his gaze. "I'm not letting this go," she said, her voice steady, though it trembled ever so slightly from the residual emotion still simmering inside her. "They can't just treat people like that, James. It wasn't just about me last night. It's about everyone who looks like me. Everyone who's ever been judged before they even said a word." James nodded, his eyes soft with understanding. "I know, Layla. You don't have to fight this alone. What do you want to do?" Layla had spent most of the night thinking about that very question. She didn't just want an apology, though they certainly owed her that. She wanted real accountability. She wanted people to see what had happened to her, to understand that this kind of treatment wasn't just an unfortunate incident, but part of a larger pattern of systemic discrimination. If nothing changed, then what had it all been for? "We're going back," she said firmly. "Not today, but soon. And I want them to know I'm not going to let this slide. I want a formal apology, not just some half-hearted words in private. They need to acknowledge what they did publicly. People need to know." James leaned back in his chair, thinking it over. "You're right," he agreed after a pause. "They need to be held accountable. And if they don't make it right, we can take it further." Layla appreciated his support, but she knew that this wasn't just about making things right for her. It was about setting an example. She thought about all the people who had been mistreated in ways that no one ever heard about. People who didn't have someone like James to stand up for them, who had no choice but to suffer in silence. She reached for her phone and pulled up the photos and videos that had started circulating online. Several customers had recorded the confrontation in the store, and it hadn't taken long for the footage to spread. There were already thousands of comments, many of them expressing outrage over how she had been treated. Her story was becoming a symbol for something bigger, and that gave her a small sense of hope. Maybe this could spark real change. "I think we need to go public with this," Layla said, her voice determined. "If they don't want to take responsibility, the world will know. I'm not going to let them sweep this under the rug." James nodded, though his expression was cautious. "Are you ready for that kind of attention? Once it's out there, you can't take it back." Layla sighed, considering his words. She knew he was right. Once they went public, there would be no turning back. But she also knew that silence was no longer an option. "I'm ready," she said finally. "We need to do this, for everyone who's been through something like this and never had their voice heard." James reached across the table and took her hand. "Whatever you need, I'm with you," he said, his voice filled with quiet strength. Layla smiled faintly, grateful for his unwavering support. They had been through so much together, and she knew that whatever came next, they would face it as a team. 2 days later, they returned to the store. Layla's stomach churned as they pulled into the parking lot. The memory of that night still haunted her, but she had steeled herself for what was about to happen. She had prepared her statement, rehearsed her words, and James had contacted the local press to ensure that this wouldn't be ignored. As they walked toward the entrance, Layla could feel the tension in the air. She knew that people would be watching, that this was her moment to take control of the narrative. She wasn't just here for herself. She was here for every black woman, for every person who had ever been wrongfully accused, humiliated, or mistreated because of who they were. When they stepped inside, it didn't take long for the manager, Gary, to notice them. His face paled when he saw James in his uniform and Layla beside him. her posture strong and determined. He clearly wasn't expecting them to return, much less with such confidence. "Ma'am, sir, can we speak privately?" Gary asked, his voice lacking the arrogance it had carried just days earlier. "We'll speak here," Layla said firmly, "and I want everyone to hear it." The store had already begun to fill with customers, many of whom had recognized her from the viral videos. Some were already recording on their phones, sensing that something important was about to happen. Layla took a deep breath, letting the strength of the moment fill her. First, she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "I want to hear an apology. Not just to me, but to everyone who has ever been treated unfairly in this store." Gary swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable with the public scrutiny. He glanced at James, then back at Layla, knowing he had no choice but to comply. We apologize," Gary stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "We deeply regret the way you were treated, and we're committed to reviewing our policies to make sure nothing like this happens again." "That's not enough," Layla said, her tone sharp. "I don't want empty promises. I want action. You need to change the way you treat people who walk through these doors. I'm not just a customer. I'm a person. And you treated me like a criminal." Gary nodded, his face flushed with shame. "We understand, and we're working on it. We'll be implementing new training programs for all staff to ensure that everyone is treated with respect, regardless of appearance or assumptions." Layla felt a surge of triumph, but she wasn't done yet. "I want this apology made public," she said, "a formal statement, acknowledging what happened and committing to real changes. And I want to see those changes implemented. If they're not, we'll take this to the next level." Gary's face blanched. He knew the store couldn't afford a public scandal, not with the videos already circulating online. He nodded quickly, eager to avoid further conflict. "Yes, ma'am. We'll issue a public apology. You have my word." Layla nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and satisfaction. She had done it. She had faced down the people who had wronged her and demanded accountability. It wasn't just about the apology. It was about the fact that they couldn't get away with treating her, or anyone else, like they were less than human. James stood beside her, his expression proud. "Is there anything else?" he asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Gary shook his head, clearly eager for the encounter to end. "No, sir. We'll make sure this never happens again." Layla turned to leave, but as she walked toward the exit, she noticed something important. The eyes of the customers, the employees, the people who had been watching. They weren't just staring at her anymore. They were nodding, murmuring in agreement, and for the first time, Layla felt like her voice had truly been heard. As they stepped outside into the fresh air, Layla let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The fight wasn't over, but it was a start. Justice wasn't always immediate or perfect, but today, it was a small victory, and that was enough. That night, Layla sat beside James on the couch, watching the news coverage of their day. The store's apology had gone public, and people were already talking about the changes being made. She knew it wouldn't fix everything, but it was a step in the right direction. "I'm proud of you," James said quietly, wrapping his arm around her. Layla smiled, leaning into him. "I'm proud of us," she replied. "We didn't let them win." James kissed her forehead gently. "No, we didn't. And we never will." Layla closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his embrace. The battle had been exhausting, but for the first time in days, she felt a sense of peace. Together, they had faced injustice, and together they had made a difference. And, for Layla, that was everything. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you want to know more stories like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel and click on the bell so you don't miss new episodes. Also, check out our other videos. You'll find even more exciting and unexpected stories. Write in the comments what you think of this story and where you're watching from.